to this week's edition of Done and Dusted. I'm your presenter, Caroline Counsel. This week, we're going to hear from Dr. Torna Pitman, who's been specialising in the much talked about and complex field of coercive control. Dr. Pitman's been doing this since 2005. I don't think you can turn on the news or listen to the terrible incidents of violence against women in particular in Australia without appreciating the importance of coercive control at the centre of family violence. But through her practical experience, her research and her education, she's developed a concept called the trap in coercive control. She's also developed a groundbreaking theory called conversational control. And this sheds some light on how a person can manipulate conversations to prevent relational justice. The work is incredibly relevant today, and she is focusing indeed on those concepts in her upcoming book, Tangled Web of Words, Understanding How Conversations Control or Connect Us. And that's due to be released shortly, if it hasn't already, in May this year. She explains the continuum of conversational control in a way that is accessible and eye-opening. She's presented on coercive control, breaking the trap. So I'm sure we're going to learn much from Dr. Pitman. Welcome, Torna.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's really nice to be here.
Unfortunately, my fellow podcaster Darren Mort can't join us, but be that as it may, let's just kick off with, I think, a fairly basic question, but it may not be a question to which many people really understand the answer, and that is, what is coercive control?
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of describing it, but the way I describe it is that it's a system. It's a course of conduct. It's a system of strategies and tactics to gain and maintain control. And they will be a different system for different types of coercive controllers. But underneath it all be a big similarity, and then there'll be different styles and types, and that's often not talked about. So it's systematic, and it will cover the whole life of the person who's the target. So I call someone who's experiencing coercive control a target rather than a victim or a survivor, primarily because a lot of people have said to me, I don't like being called a victim or a survivor. I don't feel like I'm a victim. I was subjected to a victimization process, and that's different. I don't want to be called anything because of that. And I'm not even sure if I will survive because he's still after me. The victim survivor thing doesn't work for a lot of people I've spoken to. They like the word target because that's what was happening to them. They were being targeted by a system of strategies and tactics.
And I find I always love meeting new people and hearing about how complex this sort of work is. And you've given me a moment of clarity because, of course, I've been working with people who have endured this sort of attack. I should point out also, you mentioned him and her, and I think for our listeners and viewers, it is really important that statistically speaking, in Australia and indeed across the world, family violence is in the main inflicted by men upon women. And yes, we appreciate that there are exceptions and the reverse can also be true. So when we talk this evening, we are probably going to be focusing on the vast majority of family violence cases. And Torna, is it fair to say that at the heart or underlying all forms of family violence, there's that element of coercive control?
Well, it is very fair to say it. It's very wise to say it because when, like in the old days, around in the 1970s when we were still really trying to unravel family violence, it was all focused on the physical violence, which is understandable. That's what everyone saw. That's what was happening. People were going to, women were going to hospital, not so much men. Women were going to hospital. And so the physical violence was critical to comprehend. And it's taken decades to realize that there's also a lot of family violence that does not include any physical violence, but that both the women who are being physically hit or, attacked and the ones who weren't were enduring the same pattern of control. And that coercive control has always been there. It just hadn't been articulated that well. It hadn't come to consciousness. People weren't writing about it, and those people that were writing about it were having trouble getting it across.
And therefore, Torna, when we're working with targets, thank you for that term, when we're working with targets and we as professionals, frontline responders often, we identify that this is actually happening for that individual and we lay out what they've told us before them, and they themselves do not see that they're a target of family violence or coercive control. Why is that? Is that a phenomenon that you're now very familiar with, that the actual target isn't aware that they're a target?
Absolutely. Because part of the victimization process is to instill in you that you are the problem. And if it weren't for you, this wouldn't be happening. It strips away your identity and your confidence and your sense of self to the point that you often can't really critically evaluate the relationship. And so it's quite common for people to say, oh my God, why doesn't she just leave? Can't she just see that he's a beat? But sometimes she can't. She's not at that stage because there's stages of victimizing. There's the stages to the victimization process, and it can take a while to fully comprehend what they've been subjected to. It's such a complex web of strategies and tactics that until you've experienced it, we really find it hard to understand why someone just can't see it. Why is this not plain to you? But it's not. It's the same as someone who's gone into a cult thinking that it was something else and that they were going to be joining some great community. And, years later, they have to be kidnapped out of and they've got to be deprogrammed.
So, Torna, you took the words right out of my mouth, because I've represented both targets and I've represented families and women trying to exit cults with their children.
Right.
This is in Australia, by the way, people.
Yeah.
And I reflected on the fact that often it was 1 year post removal from that influence that the pieces of being able to put their lives back together and being able to reason their way through what they've just experienced comes together with a great deal of counselling and support. So if it takes you a good 12 months to deprogram, is it any wonder why a target does not perceive themselves at the time of the relationship as being a target?
It's no wonder at all. And, we have different styles of coercive control. So some of them, the tactics and the strategies are pretty obvious. There's a lot of, full on intimidation, stalking, threatening, incidents that the police go to, physical violence. It might be a little easier and maybe a shorter process for the target to understand what's going on. But there's other styles of coercive control that are much more working on the mind and the emotions. They're a quieter style. The police are unlikely to ever attend. It's much more subtle, and it's relentless, and it's ruthless. So I found that a lot of women I do counseling with and a lot of practitioners I work with or do any training with, they're the women that just take a while to understand. what they've been subjected to. It's not a nice thing to understand, is it? Like,
No.
so
Because it's about loss of power, and you've
Yeah.
passed your power over to the perpetrator, and you are in fact being rendered yourself by virtue of that very macabre dance with that person whom you allegedly and they allegedly loved you,
yeah,
only to find out that it's smoke and mirrors.
that's right. And you know, a target is forced bit by bit by bit by bit in all manners of ways to take on an accommodating and adjusting and, you know, deferring type role. And, you know, these are mechanics of domination. These mechanics of domination underlie all the different forms of domination all around the world, you know, prisoners of war, cult, what happens, you know, when groups are against another group. It's the same process of domination or the mechanics, which is that you wear down someone's identity and their sense of self slowly but gradually. And some people know exactly how to do that.
Mm.
And we cannot say to targets, you know, what's taking you so long to work it out?
And
Not
and
fair.
it can also take targets of this sort of programming many occasions to try and separate themselves from the person imposing that dominance and power over them. I think it's really hard for people who haven't experienced to wonder why they go back. Sure, I can understand she didn't realize what was going on and therefore it took her a while to leave. But once she left, why on earth did she go back? If you could break that down, why would that be? Why does it take on average 7 times? That's the data that we have available. It might even be
Didn't know
more than that.
7, but anyway.
It might be much more than that.
Well, there's some clients that come to mind, and they were rather. I'll never forget sitting there with one who, you know, she did really have every reason in the world never to go back, and I didn't think I had no clue that she was going to, and she did. But it helps them to come to terms in themselves that they are actually making the right decision, because every time they go back, they realize they're a bit different. And also, there is that incredible pull from a coercive controller, pressing all the right buttons, saying all the right things, looking like they're vulnerable and they're really upset and they're really disconcerted. That is incredibly invitational to a target, because they don't want to have that conflict with a very scary person. They don't really want to have it, especially if they've got children. They would rather it sorted out. So they go back and they realize that they're a bit different and they don't stay for very long, or something happens and they leave. And eventually they realize that they have outgrown this person. They've just outgrown them. They can see it now. They've got themselves back a lot more and they've outgrown.
So every departure and return means that they come back more and more to themselves.
They do. I find that. I find that they finally work out that they lose hope. Once hope, people will do amazing things when they feel there's a bit of hope. And if their perpetrator gives them a bit of hope, it's extremely difficult to say, "Oh, nah, I don't actually believe in your holding out any hope." It's the hardest thing to do. If we're given a bit of hope, we tend to go for it.
Which is why, forgive me, I didn't know you felt that way. I had no idea. I'm so glad you're home. Is that what you mean by the ray of hope, that they're a changed person?
And I'm different now, and I realize now how much the trauma I had when I was, 6 has really affected me. And I've been talking to this person and that person, and I really want to give this a go. Well, it'd be extremely hard to push that back. But the other thing is that sometimes women and children have got nowhere else to go. You
So
know, like
we've heard the
practically,
nightmares, haven't we, Torna, about women and
yeah,
children sleeping in cars, like literally being homeless, couch surfing, insecure post that separation.
awful. And it makes me realize that, you know, they go back, but actually sometimes it's the man who leaves
Mm,
and they'll allow him back because, you know, he's held out a bit of hope. But there's another angle here, and that is that quite often when you've been a target of coercive control, depending on the style of coercive controller that you are with or you have been with, some of them are really adept at defaming you widely to professionals, to teachers, to community widely and very carefully and very skillfully so that you're actually quite isolated
mm,
and you have no one who really believes you or supports in you. I've seen that happen so often. Women have lost entire families and communities, like extended family, because the perpetrator has been so clever. And it's all image management, of course. So when he holds out a bit of hope and that's all going to be rectified, it's very hard not to go back.
mm. Because
Because
otherwise you potentially don't have a life.
I don't, and no community, and you're alienated and
Mm,
isolated.
mm,
So these are the sorts of things that people forget about, that the consequences of being with a coercive controller are so shocking that if there seems to be a bit of hope, well, okay, maybe I'll just give it one more try, you know, because then I could maybe breed and live and the kids can have their father. We you know, we can sort of we can get going again.
We've also talked briefly about there being children and the stress on the target in terms of upheaval and physically, financially, emotionally relocating somewhere that's going to be okay other than, you know, the car near the toilet block for the kids to use the loo at night. What else goes on in that dynamic, with the perpetrator and the target in relation to children? What are some of the experiences that targets and their children have to endure?
Well, this is where that wonderful Dr. Emma Katz is absolutely brilliant and focuses on this area. Thank goodness, because what happens for women and children with perpetrators is just a continuation of coercive control. So let me rewind a bit. Children are part of the dynamic. They live
Mm,
in the dynamic. Whatever their mother's not allowed, they're not allowed. You know, they pick it all up. They're part of the dynamic, and sometimes they are divided. The children are divided and conquered, and so he'll scapegoat one and favor the other, or he'll turn them against the mother, or he will undermine her parenting, or he will make them feel beholden to them, make them feel beholden to him in some way. For a mother who's already been worn down, you know, slowly but surely by the emotional abuse, the generally the sexual disrespect, the financial abuse or disrespect, that the whole every area of her life being affected by him, it's extremely tricky to know how to counter his way he parents the children and the way he undermines her parenting of the children. It's dynamite. It's perpetrators have a ball here because they can easily claim that she's an unfit mother
mm,
and get in there and cause so much trouble and use the legal system to their advantage, which they've been able to do, to actually get really unfair and not good shared parenting arrangements,
mm,
because they don't share parent. They don't share anything. You cannot have a conversation with a coercive controller about the children and survive that conversation.
mm,
It's not possible.
mm.
But that is where the coercive controller is in their element, because they are still controlling the whole family. They're just not living with them anymore.
And of course, you have somebody who has been so put upon in terms of the mother, and she's so depleted, and her energy bank by the time she's able to extricate herself physically with some, none, all of the children, doesn't matter what. Yes, at times, I think at first blush, without understanding that bigger dynamic, she may appear to not be capable of marshalling, managing, and parenting children. And that's a very sad element that's misunderstood, overlooked, and not picked apart as it should be to identify, well, what is the dynamic here? You know, has this man been turning these children into soldiers for him? Has he been pitting them against each other? Has he been pitting them against the mother? And that takes time. And you have to also give that woman the right support to allow her to literally be deprogrammed. And I know there's probably, because a lot of my male clients listen to this podcast and are grateful for it. And I know a lot of men listening to this are going to find this very confronting, like you're painting us to be the bad guys. No, we're not. It's not all men. I have to stress that absolutely. This is not all men.
No, not at all. I mean, it can, of course, it can happen between any gender. You know, we're not even talking about just male and female anymore. I talk every gender now because I've worked with every gender, and I've seen, you know, two women living together who one was coercing the other, and there was post-separation shared parenting that was like World War III. For the same reasons, exactly the same mechanics of domination. But typically, you know, we've talked about it between men and women for so long now that it's almost habitual.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you know, when we think historically, men did used to own women and the children. And that still comes on down the pipeline, doesn't it? Where men feel, you know, these are my children. And they won't necessarily own, and this happens for women too, they won't necessarily own how they have treated the mother of the children, how they have depleted her, how they have made the conversations go in the relationship, what their parenting style is like. They're not going to take it on. They are not, because a coercive controller has a very fixed attitudinal style, which does not take on information or influence from other people unless it suits them. So they have a very superior, very entitled, very adversarial attitudinal style, which means that they are, you know, impossible to have a fair conversation with. And we have to remember that when it comes to shared parenting. It's like, it's not going to work.
Well, it's interesting because as of the 6th of May, 2024, new regime under the Family Law Act in relation to focusing much more on family violence and safety for children, but also safety of vulnerable others when determining what is in the best interests of children. So it's what I think is going to concern us in our area of family law is that this may not be identified properly. The dynamics may not be fully appreciated. The narrative of a woman who is a target has not been given the right space, time to develop or cure, if you will. I often think of family violence dynamics when you're speaking to a target who's extricated herself. I often say it's like opening a tiny little, you know, those tiny tins of tuna from Woolies or Coles, and you open that tiny little tin and all of a sudden there's an ocean, and she didn't even realize there was an ocean underneath her. She had no idea. She thought her life was compacted into that tiny tin of tuna, and there's so much to unpack. You've hit on the topic of the concept of ownership of women, the fact that children haven't really been identified as people in their own right until relatively recently in human history. Are there other reasons why we end up with perpetrators of coercive control, because I might add, there is a degree of lethality around coercive control that I find deeply disturbing in my practice, with either one or a minor physical incident, but the volcano of control brewing the entire time. So why is it that we have people, and you've correctly identified women as well, why is it that we have these people using that as their modus operandi?
I'm not sure I have the wisest answer in the world to that, but what comes to mind is that when we have a perpetrator and they've got a very superior, entitled, adversarial, attitudinal style, they are going to have particular expectations. Now, they're unfair expectations, they're illogical and they're irrational, and they can change. But when their expectations are not met, when their target is not doing as they should be doing in their eyes, then that volcano starts to erupt. It's unfair expectations and it creates their very abusive anger, which means you are done for. You are not doing as you should be doing. I expect, they don't even understand to say to themselves, I'm expecting her to behave, to hang around me, to do as I say, and to, live a smaller life as I let her live. Like their unfair expectations. But when you go underneath their behavior and you look at their expectations, they are unfair, illogical, and irrational, and they are prone to being wildly angry unfairly. They're not healthy boundaries. Like we get angry over, a healthy boundary of ours being violated. These women are not violating their healthy boundaries. They're just not meeting their unfair expectations. It's a different kind of anger.
So there's nothing these women can do ultimately to appease.
Well, sometimes they figure out certain ways to appease.
Strategies for survival.
But who wants to live like that? And also, like Hannah Clark, she wanted to leave. She, and he had never hit her, apparently. But the fact that she was no longer under his thumb and doing what he expected of her was more than he could take, because unfair, abusive anger. Like, it's not exactly because he was distressed. Anger.
I think as a society, we would all have to agree that what we want to see an end of is the killing of women or intimate partner violence of any sort. And more than that, in terms of the legacy the perpetrator leaves for their children, think of that if the children survive. And in Hannah Clark's case, of course, the children did not survive.
No.
So we as a society, we must all step up. We should learn more, talk more, understand more, and be on alert for these dynamics, particularly those of us, say, in law, where we don't have 1 hour of compulsory family violence training. So that is something I'm certainly trying to change by virtue of this podcast, as is my fellow podcaster, Darren Moore, one conversation at a time. Now, I'm aware, of course, you've written a book, and I would like to invite you back specifically to talk about what that book entails and what that particular learning journey took you on, and why is the spoken word so important in terms of that coercive control dynamic, if I've understood the book correctly. And I'll read it before we do that recording so we can have that conversation.
Luckily, it's not too long. It's not a huge, big text. Like, I don't know if you've read Evan Stark's great big coercive, the entrapment of women. It's such a big, thick, heavy text. Mine's quite simple and easy to read.
Well, I look forward both to reading it, but also Darren and I look forward to having you back on Done and Dusted. And so thank you, Dr. Torna Pitman, for being our guest this week on Done and Dusted.
Thanks, Caroline.